Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Hydrogen in Europe, the Perspective of the Gas Industry. We're grateful to both of our moderators, Dr. Aaron Praktineau and Reinhard Haas, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. We're also very grateful to both GEE and AAEE, the affiliates of IAEE, for sponsoring this webinar today. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We're the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderators. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Aaron Praktineau, Professor of Energy Resources and Innovation Economics at RWTH, Aachen. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to welcome you also from GEE's side. GEE is the German affiliate of the IAEE. And our affiliate was founded in 1981 during the debate in Germany of phasing out nuclear energy. And our goal was to provide a neutral ground for discussion which are respectful yet also controversial on the topic of energy. And so if you are interested in joining our discussions, please also check out our website, www.gee.de. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which will talk about the topic of hydrogen. For those of you who have joined us already in July, where we organized our first webinar with IAEE, we had Professor Georg Erdmann, who will be co-moderating with me from GEE's side, and Professor Andreas Löschel, who were talking about the European Green Deal. And one topic which was left out due to time restrictions was the topic of hydrogen. And so we are very pleased that from GEE's side that we are able to provide you with 2 very interesting speeches today on the topic of hydrogen, and that GEE is not doing this alone, but also with our Austrian sister Reinhard Haas from the AAEE. Thank you very much, and Reinhard, to you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Reinhard Haas. I'm with the Austrian affiliate of the IAEE, the AIEE, and we were founded a little bit later than our German sister. It was only in 1989. We have already organized several international conferences in Austria, in Vienna, of the IAEE. The last one was in 2017. We do not yet know when the next one could be, because not just because of Corona, but also because of other conditions around us. Anyway, we like to be in the IAEE and to contribute to the international discussion, especially also with our German friends. Today, I will first introduce our first speaker, who is Mr. Dr. Tim Keller. He has been serving as chairman and CEO of Germany's leading gas advocacy group, Zukunft Erdgas, in English, Future of Natural Gas, and he did it since the foundation of this group. And to further promote the benefits of natural gas mobility on a European level, Mr. Keller was appointed president at the Natural Gas Association Europe in September 2020, 2 months ago. And before that, Mr. Keller held various management positions at the BMW Group over a time period of 12 years. He served as Vice President Marketing, Pre-Development, Innovation, and he was responsible for the Marketing Innovation Think Tank, Telematics and Online Services, as well as the Hydrogen Vehicle Initiative of BMW Clean Energy. It's a great pleasure now to invite Mr. Keller for his presentation. I would just like to say 3 critical words from my point of view regarding hydrogen. We know hydrogen has been since more than 100 years a visionary energy carrier, but I would say critically, so far hydrogen has not yet delivered in the energy sector. And hydrogen technologies are costly. I think the hydrogen system as a general is not the most efficient one. We have many losses in different parts of the chain. And finally, for several applications, I would say the technologies are not really major. But now I look forward to your presentation, Mr. Keller, and what is your statement around hydrogen? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Haas, and thank you very much for the kind words for the introduction. And yes, and thank you for mentioning that I used to work for BMW and working on a hydrogen vehicle those days. Actually, for me, it's actually the second time I'm experiencing the hydrogen hype. And today I would like to explain why I believe this is a much more sustainable approach to hydrogen today than it used to be 15, 20 years ago when we had this very strong hype around vehicles. Because today we clearly see that hydrogen is something that has been picked up by the whole energy system, particularly also within the gas industry, which I am representing here. And thus we have a much broader approach, not only in terms of usage of hydrogen in specific sectors, but we now have a clear understanding on how to produce hydrogen, on how to distribute hydrogen, and of course, what kind of usages should be used. To start with, I would quickly give you some thoughts on why hydrogen is on the agenda or should be on the agenda when it comes to decarbonization. As you all know, Europe has the ambition to become the first climate neutral continent. That has been formulated by our the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. So the target is clear. We want to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. That has been laid out, and that's the reason why we're discussing things like the Green Deal. The reason why hydrogen is plays a major role in this Green Deal is quite obvious. If you look at the EU's final energy consumption, it becomes pretty obvious that electricity, which has been seen as the most efficient and most dominant route to decarbonization, only accounts for 20% of our end usage here in Europe, and 80% is something else. It's not electrons, it's molecules, energy that can be stored and easily transported. And for that reason, of course, is used in many sectors which cannot be reached by electricity today. Another thing that needs to be taken into account, electricity in Europe is not clean in general. Right now, about 1/3 of the electricity that we use here in Europe comes from renewables. That's a good achievement, and the growth path is quite clear. We see very ambitious growth rates. We've seen ambitious growth rates, and hopefully this growth will continue. But I think this pie chart alone shows that there's still quite a bit of work ahead of us to change the generation of electricity to renewables before we start producing renewable electricity for the other sectors which are using energy as well. So we need molecules, but not only to achieve the decarbonization in all the sectors, we need them also to store them. On this simple picture, which depicts the energy consumption of an average German household, explains quite clearly that the whole story is not about only delivering the amount of energy during the course of the year, but you have to be ready and produce and provide energy at the coldest and darkest day in the year, particularly when no wind is blowing. So we need storage, and the gas grid in particular, which connects half of the German homes, for instance, with 500,000 kilometers of line, is a perfect storage capacity. So we also need to talk about a kilowatt and not only about kilowatt hours. And this has led to the situation that we see a very strong political ambition to move towards hydrogen, not only that we have since July the 8th a European hydrogen strategy in place, which has a lot of perspectives on delivering hydrogen, but of course we see many national and regional hydrogen strategies. So the idea of using hydrogen as the second pillar of the Energiewende is trickling down to the individual governments and municipalities. And it's not only the European Union, but also its neighbors are clearly delivering in terms of hydrogen. So it is a very broad trend, and the individual economies are trying to provide with their individual perspectives. So of course, those countries with the strong renewables potential are trying to deliver in terms of production of hydrogen, and other countries are more focusing on technology. So, and this is a picture from IEA. I think the train is underway towards a complete hydrogen economy that is looking at the production, the transmission, and of course, the delivering of the hydrogen to different demand sectors. Today, I would like to elaborate a little bit on which markets are interesting. I want to pick out one which is for us of high importance. I think the first market that we will see where hydrogen will play a role is, of course, those where hydrogen is already existent. We have 60 terawatt hours of hydrogen, for instance, here in Germany, being used mainly for the production of methanol, fuels, and ammonia. This is still gray hydrogen, which is waiting for decarbonization. So I think the very natural approach to a new hydrogen market is to replace the gray hydrogen, which is already quite a bit of amount of hydrogen that needs to be produced coming from renewable or carbon neutral sources. But of course, the ideas are very wide-ranging where hydrogen can be used tomorrow. It could be used in turbines, it could be used in stationary fuel cells as combined heat and power solutions. Mobility is a very strong condition. And of course, industry, the German steel industry is strongly asking for hydrogen to move their processes towards carbon neutrality. But let me please focus on one specific area where we think hydrogen should play a major role as well. That's the heating sector. That can be reached by boilers, but also by fuel cells. I will show that later. Why the heating sector? It accounts for 40% of our energy consumption. It's mostly molecules. In Germany, we have still many boilers with oil. We have 20 million gas boilers. We have them connected to a grid that is able to deliver hydrogen to the home. So why not think about the heating sector, particularly as you see it in this chart for the cold winter days. We need strong amounts of energy, and it's not really foreseeable when we have enough solar and wind available to deliver enough electricity to electrify all the heating that we have, despite very strong efforts towards insulation, despite strong growth rates of heat pumps that we see these days in the market. But is the growth of the renewable energy production enough? It's questionable, particularly as we still need to replace coal in our system. So we believe that hydrogen in the heating sector, particularly with high efficient technologies such as the fuel cell technology that can be connected to the gas grids today and tomorrow can be used with hydrogen, are very interesting solutions, particularly for existing buildings. You see here the product of the market-leading company Viessmann. It's a small-scale combined heat and power solution that provides electricity and heat for your home, for instance, for charging your EV at home. We also have larger installations like the SOFC fuel cell coming from Bosch, delivering 10 kilowatts of electricity. It's scalable up to 1 megawatt, which is mainly focusing on decentral electricity production at an efficiency rate of 60%. It's producing electricity at a higher efficiency than many of the large-scale thermal power plants. But where should the hydrogen come from? We should certainly focus on a broad range of opportunities. Electrolysis, of course, is the first choice because it's integrating renewables, it's storing intermittent renewable energy sources. But this alone, if you do the math, you will see that this alone will not deliver enough hydrogen to provide contribution to the decarbonization effort. So we need other solutions. We need pyrolysis as solution. We need steam reforming. Particularly steam reforming is something that our Norwegian colleagues are strongly developing. Their very ambitious Longship project looks extremely interesting and promising. But we should also, and that's something I would like to bring to the discussion today, we should also look into the system of pyrolysis. Let me briefly show you what it's all about. We need to find carbon neutral hydrogen, regardless which technology we use. So the carbon footprint of the hydrogen that we provide is important, of course, paired with the price point. And you see in this chart here, which is a calculation of different hydrogen production routes, electrolysis, pyrolysis, different technologies involved there, and also steam reforming. You see that electrolysis, for instance, is very much dependent on the input energy, of course. You see also that other routes can deliver, depending on what kind of measure you take, if it's the EU taxonomy or the Certify project, can deliver carbon neutral hydrogen that can be used for decarbonization. And you see that particularly the routes with pyrolysis seem to be quite interesting looking at this comparison. Pyrolysis basically is nothing else than splitting up the methane molecule, CH4, delivering at the end hydrogen and carbon as the feedstock. So the process requires, of course, natural gas, which is an ample resource, and uses renewable energy as an input energy to split up the methane molecule into its core substances, hydrogen and carbon. Hydrogen can be used in the grid, of course, in different routes. Carbon is an interesting feedstock today used for polymers, pigments, and also for batteries. In future, it can be used for building materials, soil enrichment, and other bulk resources where you need strong or high amounts of this kind of feedstock. Very interesting technology that should be considered also as a solution for further hydrogen production, particularly, and this is the core reason why we feel that this is a very fascinating solution, particularly because it's much simpler to split up the methane molecule than splitting up the water molecule that the process of electrolysis is basing on. So the chemical situation is that the bonding between the hydrogen and the carbon molecule is much weaker than the bonding between the oxygen and the hydrogen atoms in the water molecule. For this reason, it requires only 1/7 of the energy to split up methane in order to create carbon neutral. Because no CO2 is released into the atmosphere, carbon neutral hydrogen. And if you use renewable energy as a feedstock for this pyrolysis technology, you can create 3, 4, 5 times, depending on the engineering efficiency of the pyrolysis technology, and there are different routes that are available, 4 times the amount of hydrogen based on one input unit of renewable energy. So you have the factor of 4 based on the input electricity coming from renewables. So a strong lever for producing and linking the renewable energy production with the gas grid, and of course, multiplying the input energy coming from wind and solar. Very promising technology, linking also the gas industry with renewable energy so that we have a good solution for providing large amounts of affordable hydrogen. To end with and to hand over to Daniel, let's have a quick look back at this overview chart of hydrogen economy. So we had a look at why we need hydrogen. We had a look at which sectors hydrogen could be used. We had a look at how this can be produced. And now Daniel will explain us how does the hydrogen come to your home or to your factory. Is it the gas grid? Is it the truck? Daniel will explain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think this was a really very basic, sound and comprehensive introduction into what hydrogen can do in the system, what hydrogen can contribute, and where especially hydrogen comes from. From my point of view, this is not, let's say, in an international dimension fully clear, because we are now discussing huge amounts of hydrogen from huge amounts of renewable electricity. And I think neither Germany nor Austria nor any other, let's say, northern country will really be able to produce these quantities. However, I know Germany has already agreed with Morocco on a joint venture with respect to electrolysis coming from the desert, which is quite an interesting international idea. However, now I give the floor to Georg Erdmann, and he will continue the moderation of this nice event. And Georg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. Before going to the next speaker, I just have a small question to Tim. Because I think you did not explain us where is the technology of pyrolysis today. Is this in a state of experimental research, or is it somehow very close to real projects?
So the core idea of pyrolysis is something which is very old, obviously, and is being used in various processes, but not yet with the focus on hydrogen production. So pyrolysis is mainly used for other chemical approaches. So the basic idea is known. If you look at different technologies for hydrogen production, of course, you see that there are some technologies that have a very low technology readiness level, something like 3 or 4. Others are in the range of 6 to 7. And the beauty of this process is, as it's well known, it's more or less an engineering scaling exercise. And as no real development has been taken on to develop hydrogen production technologies using pyrolysis as a core technology, I think there's a lot of potential to develop it further. There are worldwide 2-3 installations which are already running on a daily basis, which you can have a look at. But still, this technology needs scaling. But we are quite confident that with this focus on hydrogen production, on cheap hydrogen production, we will see a strong scale up of all these technologies.
So thank you very much for this explication. We will have more discussion at the end of the second presentation, which is presented by Daniel Mutmann. Daniel is a very long time active in the German gas industry, and he worked for practically all the big names like Ruhrgas and E.ON and BP. And in 2017, he was appointed as head of strategy, policy and communication at the Open Grid Europe. This is one of the big transport gas companies. And of course, the idea is that that these gas companies, these transport companies, they of course need to know what could be the use of these gas pipelines in the future, and therefore this kind of strategical thinking is very, very important for the future of this industry. So Tim, I think you are part of a group of European gas experts who developed a very interesting report about how to transform the European transmission gas system for transporting hydrogen. And I was very astonished and how realistic this study is. But I don't know whether you will talk about this, but anyhow, I'm interested to see what you will talk to us. Thank you, Daniel, and its floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are listening to us. One thing I would like to share with you just at the start is the ones of us who have been working in this field of hydrogen for a number of years now are of course throwing around words and using things that we have become quite used to. I'm pretty sure that this presentation is full of information and it might be a little bit of an overflow, but I'm lucky and I have understood that we have a chance to discuss afterwards and to address questions. So please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A session. What I would like to do today is to do a few things. First, introduce a little bit my background and where I'm coming from, the company background, so that you understand that. Again, also talking about the big picture and why hydrogen is actually now different than maybe in previous decades. As Reinhard put it, it has come up many times, but it never really made it or delivered, as he said. Then we're coming to the field of gas infrastructure and why I believe this is a key enabler, and the European perspective, which is what Georg just highlighted, which is like the highlight of the presentation, and then we will be there for an outlook and open for a discussion. So just a little bit on where I'm coming from, OGE, Open Grid Europe. Here you see a map of Germany, and basically this is showing the main transmission system pipelines that we own and operate. You see here also where we are located. It's the largest gas TSO in Germany. We have about 12,000 kilometers of pipeline. Just for referencing, so the send out to customers in Germany, which could be big industrial customers, or it could be DSOs that take over the volumes to distribute them further, was 650 terawatt hours in 2018. This is not including the transit volumes, which also flow through our pipelines, for example, from east to west or from north to south. So as Georg put it, if you're operating a national gas grid and you are confronted with the fact that we want to decarbonize, there is a few questions you need to answer, especially to your shareholders, as to what is your future contribution? Can you actually help in making this decarbonization a reality? So for that, it's important to know who we are owned. And unlike in some other countries, the infrastructure is not a state activity, but it's privately owned. And we are owned by these big names that some of you may know. So institutional investors, managing pension funds, and very keen on a long-term strategy. And when I was hired into the company, one of the first questions was really, what is the place for OGE in decarbonization? And what is our sort of strategic answer to that? Which brings me to the big picture. And again, you will see some repetition of what Tim said, but maybe from a slightly different angle. One thing which I think is very important whenever we're talking about hydrogen, we're not really talking about hydrogen. We are talking about how can we achieve climate targets and find the most efficient way of avoiding CO2. And some of us, and I think especially Tim and myself are one of these group, believe that letting hydrogen play a big role alongside renewable power might be a clever way to do so. So this is actually what we are trying to achieve. And we all know, here you see CO2 emissions, they're supposed to go down almost to zero in 2050. That is only 30 years away. and we are big energy consumers. So how can we actually achieve that? This is the key challenge that we all have. So again, my take on it is you've seen curves similar to the ones from Tim, but this is not the individual household. This is actually the energy capacity requirement for Germany during 1 year. And you see 3 curves. The green one is the renewable power generation, wind and solar. The pink one, at least on my screen, it is pink, is the power consumption. And the blue one is the gas consumption in the market area. And it's all in gigawatts, so somewhat comparable. And a few things you can see here. There are days when the green and the pink curve touch each other. That's days when politicians are very proud to say, today, all the energy requirement that we have is actually met with renewable power, which is true. Equally true, though, there's a lot of space between the curves. And if you take the blue curve into account, which has a high seasonality because of the heating market that we talked about and that Tim mentioned, then you see where the challenge is. If you want to bring the green curve up to a level to actually manage the blue peaks, in addition with the pink, then you need like about 8 or 10 times as much renewables as we have today, which we all know is going to be extremely challenging. And it's also a problem that usually you don't have the green power in the area where you need it. So you need to build a lot of power lines. That's the capacity picture. Another view on the sort of basically quantity energy amount picture. Again, a different type of presentation. Electrons and molecules, both two added together is the final energy demand in Germany in one particular year, 2018. And this is again reiterating what Tim said. We are increasing the green shares. We are actually in 2020, this green share on the left would be even higher. It's also true that we will see a rising share of electricity. So the yellow bar will move further to the right. And the whole box will be shrinking because we have energy efficiency. But however you put it, there is going to be quite a substantial space to be filled. And if we look at today's technologies, depending on where you are in the world, you might have quite some potential on biomass, but we know this is not available everywhere. And then you pretty quickly end up with, well, if you have molecules, you have a chemical energy carrier. That could be H2 or it could be something related to H2. But this is in our view why we came to the conclusion, taking these two pictures, you need to store and transport large amount of green energy. You need additional decarbonization options available to all sectors, especially sectors where you have trouble decarbonizing with power. And it is also not the worst thing to have an energy system that is basically standing on 2 feet. One is electrons and one is molecule when it comes to resilience and security of supply. So that's how we come to hydrogen in the first place. So now picking up on Reinhard's point, what's the difference compared to previous times? Why should hydrogen deliver this time? Well, I think there's 5 reasons for this. The first one, we have a general awareness today that there is a lot of renewable energy out there on our planet. It's not necessarily always where we need it. That's why transportation and storage is important, but there is a lot of renewable energy, which may not have been the awareness a few 10 or 20 years ago. I think the biggest difference is there is no alternative today. In the past, hydrogen came up. It was seen as technically viable. It was seen as extremely expensive. People said, let's rather take oil or gas because we have it and it's cheap. If we want to defossilize the industry, that is not available anymore. So we don't really have an alternative. I think also we have become much more comfortable with economies of scale. If you look at the development of the cost of solar or wind energy, that has decreased big time. That means producing power with renewables is much cheaper, as much as electrolyzers, who today are mostly put together by hand, could be much cheaper if you think about industrial production. From a European perspective, of course, Europe has a front-running option. We have a very interconnected gas infrastructure all across Europe. If you could make that available for hydrogen, you would have a basis for a European market, many sources, many sinks. that would also attract imports. And finally, we are in Corona times. Everybody's looking for economic stimulus, and hydrogen is offering quite some opportunities for industry leadership. And finally, of course, if you dig into the subject, you will find many studies over the past 2-3 years that have concluded that the societal cost benefits, if you look at a mix of renewable power and green gas or decarbonized gas, you will actually see that that has a lot of benefits. Now, what is the role of gas infrastructure in all of this? I think the first one I'd like to illustrate with this picture here. On the right-hand side, you see 8 pillars of power lines. On the left-hand side, you see nothing but a yellow post saying, here's a gas pipeline. The message I want to give you is that a 48-inch pipeline used for natural gas has about 24 gigawatts of capacity, which is about the same energy transportation capacity as the hydrogen, as the power lines in the other picture. So we have this asset in many countries. It's there, it's permitted. There is people who know how to run it. It would be really unwise not to consider if we can use it. And then also, little spoiler alert, I'm coming to this later on. If you're using a gas pipeline with hydrogen, even though hydrogen has only 1/3 of the energy content per cubic meter, because the molecules are smaller and because it actually flows faster, our experts, alongside the other European pipeline experts, have done analysis and come to the conclusion that actually your pipeline has about 80% of the energy transportation capacity if you use it with hydrogen. That's one element why it is a unique selling point. And the other one is the infrastructure is connected to gas storages, especially the salt caverns, which we have in the northwest of Europe quite extensively, are able to store hydrogen. And that's where, if you remember the picture we just showed earlier, where the whole thing becomes really, a story, is that you have infrastructure in place for transporting and storing large amounts of this clean gas. So what does it mean for us as an industry? Well, the first thing is we cannot claim something if we really don't understand our assets. So we as OGE, and we know that the other TSOs have done similar projects around H2 suitability. So really understanding all your components in your asset, existing pipelines as new pipelines. What about blending? And I'll come to that in a second. And what about 100% hydrogen? And we do that supplemented by exchange between companies and also with the associations. So a lot is ongoing there, and we will see one after the other results being produced, which so far all look very promising. Now this chart is very full. It's a chart of the German Energy Association. I'm trying to talk you through, but it's important because it's our vision for gas infrastructure in Germany, given the experience we have gathered from our projects. And this is shared actually now by a vast variety of companies across the energy spectrum. So we foresee for our system that probably on a TSO level, which is the high pressure pipeline system, that we have parallel infrastructure. We will have methane infrastructure where methane increasingly has to become green, so produced in a CO2-free way. And we will have a hydrogen system, which will be predominantly based on repurposed existing pipelines. And the main reason for that is that we want from the outset be prepared for trade and a European market and security of supply. And if you want to make sure that cross-border you have a free flow, it is much easier if you know it's 100% hydrogen rather than having potentially different blends in each country. Also, if you transport hydrogen on a TSO level in a pure form, when you go further to the DSO level, you are much more flexible. You can actually provide it to industry that needs it in pure form. You can blend it on a regional level, depending on what the circumstances and the production facilities there are. So there's many reasons of which I can give you also more when we discuss. On a DSO level, we think it's more regional and it depends on where you are. If you are in an area with a lot of biomass, maybe biomethane is your way to go. And why should you actually include hydrogen in your mix? If you are in another area where there's a lot of hydrogen because there is an industry cluster that has been developed and so is supplied with 100% hydrogen, you should actually be wise and use the region and the corridor to decarbonize other sectors as well. So summarizing, TSO level, parallel infrastructures, blending only very limited basis for this Europe-wide system, and an access point for your imports. And it's like the big highways, north, south, west, east. Whereas on a DSO level, we see more regional variety. There could be 100% grids, there could be blended systems, there could be biomethane. And actually, the DSO system is benefiting from methane and a hydrogen pipeline bypassing, because then you can do pretty much every blend that you want. The German TSOs has actually gone a step further. We have an established network development plan process, which is sort of legally in place. It is approved by the regulator. And we actually took this process and thought about how to take it forward. And we said, well, if the future system is partly depending on repurposed pipelines, we have to include it in the planning process, because the pipelines you take for hydrogen will not be available for methane anymore. So we actually asked the market for where is your demand for hydrogen entry or exit from the system. And then we included this and calculated in a scenario planning, how would this grid actually look like, and how would it, based on current market assessment, develop? And you see here a part of Germany with the blue lines, which is like what we call the Startnetz, so the starting infrastructure, where the first conversions would happen. And then the big picture, if you zoom out, where you see the all of Germany and the green lines, this is sort of a 2040-ish view based 90% on converted pipelines, where we could actually access most of the demand areas and create a hydrogen infrastructure, mainly based on what is there today. As OGE, although focusing on infrastructure, we are cooperating with a whole load of companies to develop sort of various perspectives, because we are believing that we need to get into this upscaling. So getting away from the 1-2 megawatt electrolyzer and production facilities to 30, 100 or 1,000 megawatts, which is the gigawatt class, and the implications for infrastructure that has. So just to give you an idea that over and above the pure infrastructure play, we're trying to cooperate with others to demonstrate how this could work and get the first real projects off the ground where we could actually look after the infrastructure for that. So coming to the European perspective, which is like sort of the high point of this presentation. What we did, and this is a pretty full slide, I'm aware, is that I happen to be the chairman of the European Gas for Climate initiative right now, which is a group of 10 European TSOs and 2 biogas associations looking after, you know, what is our contribution and then what could green gas and infrastructure actually contribute to a carbon neutral energy system in 2050. And we said all of what we see in these various countries, like the German example, is happening in other countries too. And the big advantage and strength of the European market is that we can actually think it together. We have a secure framework for investments, low country risks and all that. So let's look at each country and then sit together from an infrastructure perspective, how this could over time basically grow together. And the result of this is the map you see here. And the fact that some countries are gray is not that these countries are not included. It's basically just pays tribute to the fact that we are a group of, you know, companies for those countries, and we are used to working with each other very fast and agile for the last 3 years. So we said, let's just start with that and then see how it develops further. And the map you see here is a map for 100% dedicated hydrogen infrastructure, which would start with about 6,800 kilometers by 2030 and then develop into about 23,000 kilometers by 2040, which is probably not the end point, but it shows you here what the reach is. And then you actually can connect the east to the west and the north to the south. Then we actually started assessing what would be the cost of doing that. Also taking into account the yellow strips that you see on the map, which will show you where there will be some need for new builds because there currently is no pipeline connection. And we did an assessment, an initial assessment as to what do we believe is the cost for doing this and for transporting hydrogen, because the whole picture of hydrogen for me is like a jigsaw puzzle. We have a few pieces now on the wall, but it's no complete picture yet. And we wanted to contribute with the infrastructure picture. And one important point is it feasible economically to transport hydrogen, for example, from the North Sea all the way down to France, or from Spain or Portugal all the way up to Germany or the Netherlands? And we are very confident that that is possible, actually. And you see the costs which are outlined here, which still have a big span because there are uncertainties. That's why we actually showed the whole span, that these costs are not prohibitively high given where the actual cost of hydrogen production are, which we really need to bring down. So just give you the idea. Now, Tim already asked the question, where is this all coming from? And this is very illustrative. There is more information to that. But if you just consider within Europe, the very windy areas offshore, and also the solar areas in the south, you end up with quite some potential. So I would question, even though I know the question that always comes up, we don't have enough renewable power alone, so how the hell should we get all this power to produce this? And I'm inviting you to sort of back of envelope calculation. And I'm sorry, it's afternoon, more rather tea time than looking at numbers, but just a very simplified example. In our Gas for Climate study, we concluded in April this year that there could be as much as 1,300 terawatt hours per year demand for green hydrogen. So just for simplicity, let's split it up 50-50, and let's assume 50% is produced from wind and 50% is produced from solar PV. So 650 each. And let's assume further that for offshore wind, we have 4,000 hours load factor and about 70% efficiency in the electrolyzer. That would mean we need 230 gigawatts. That's about 23,000 wind turbines of the 10 megawatt class. Now it sounds huge, and this whole energy transformation is huge. But on the other hand, Agora Energiewende, which is a German think tank for energy, by the way, for example, they suggest an offshore potential wind of 500 gigawatts for Europe, just to put things in perspective. So we need big decisions, but it is not unreasonable to consider that that's possible. If you go solar, 2,000 hours, same efficiency, 465 gigawatts, which equals about 4,650 square kilometers of solar PV area. Again, it's big, but it's not as big as it sounds, because this is assuming you do this all in one space, in one place. How much share is this of the regions that we're talking? Just two examples here. So I think it's important that we start here and that we start now, but we have to allow ourselves, and also, by the way, the policymakers, to think big, because ultimately, if you want to start with the first steps, you need to take the right direction so that you allow it to be big afterwards. So concluding, we say infrastructure provides you with a physical access to multiple sources of hydrogen. It provides you with non-discriminatory access to transportation, import and storage sites, which is important if you want a market and no discrimination, of course. As the TSOs, we're experts in gas transportation, in integrated infrastructure planning. That is also important. If you build an electrolyzer, that has implications for your power system, power infrastructure. And we have a close cooperation with the DSOs, which in my view offers a lot of decarbonization options. So the next steps, which is also important, which we can discuss, the one thing you need is, of course, policymakers need to set the legal frameworks right. Today, in most countries, hydrogen as an energy carrier is not foreseen legally. So everybody owning infrastructure can be prepared to do the nicest things, but they need a stable framework also for their business model, of course. Finally, the outlook. I think it's very important for everyone to acknowledge that it's all about aligning the value chain to achieve a scale up. Cooperation is a key, and we have many challenges to sort of manage. But on the other hand, I think the momentum that we see right now, and this is my concluding remark, if you look at all the national hydrogen strategies which have been published just over the last 2 years, then you see how the momentum is rising. And I'm very confident that we see the hydrogen era. This time it's dawning, Reinhard, this time it will deliver, and we'll see a global market. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think one of the big advantages of your study and of this work you are presented here is that you discussed with the customers. It's not a scientific exercise where we discussed in academic world about engineers and economists and legal people, but you discussed with customers. And I think this is a step forward, and your presentation showed a little bit that you really have done a step forward, and this makes this presentation particularly interesting for all of us. But I must say we have a lot of rather interesting questions, and I hope we are able to answer most of them. And I would like to go through these questions, and the first one is going to Tim, and he asks, what are the efficiency rates of pyrolysis processes?
Yeah,
there some experience about this?
It's a simple but very telling and important question, because it's all about efficiency at the end of the day. That's for sure. If we look at the challenges that we're facing, it's about decarbonization, and if you look at the scarce resource that we have, which are renewable energy, so efficiency should be defined. How much decarbonization do we get from one part of renewable energy? And this is how we define the efficiency of the pyrolysis process. So if you put in one part of renewable energy, you will gain something like 4 parts of hydrogen, which is carbon neutral at the end of the day. So you have a lever of 4, roughly speaking, giving the technical efficiencies behind it in terms of decarbonization. This, of course, is based on a specific definition of efficiency. It's based on the assumption that methane is not understood as an energy input, but as a feedstock, like water for electrolysis.
Okay. The next question, there are some questions you want to answer directly, so I will go through this. One of this is, of course, interesting. What is the cost per kilogram H2? Of course, this is very speculative numbers which you produce, but
it's I think we're talking about energy economics here. Of course, the important question. We do not have any concise numbers yet that show comparisons. We have a couple of studies underway which are bound to be published during this year. But as a first indication from what we get from the different institutes is that in the midterm, blue hydrogen, regardless which route, with CCS or with pyrolysis, seems to be cheaper than green hydrogen. So it can be used for a quick market take-up. In the long run, take 20 years, 30 years ahead, we see that in many regions, not necessarily here that in many regions, not here in Germany, green hydrogen will become competitive due to the cost regression of renewables, particularly PV. But pyrolysis, based on the currently low gas price that we see, will remain also a quite attractive solution for creating bulk amounts of hydrogen. So we see a transition from blue or turquoise towards green, but we need large amounts of hydrogen to kickstart the hydrogen economy. Otherwise, it's simply a very luxurious activity for very small market niches.
Thank you very much. Another question coming from Chris Gong. And he asked a very interesting question. It seems unlikely that the transmission loss from North Africa to Europe is larger than the loss from H2 conversion.
Great question, Chris. Well, it always depends on how far you have to transport hydrogen, and I think Daniel will also jump in with his evaluations on transport efficiency. But generally speaking, we have to acknowledge that transporting electricity in the given context, and here in Germany, we're trying to build grids from north to south. Accounts for, well, if you take 100 kilometers of grid, something like 2% of transmission losses, whereas the gas grid only requires 0.5% of 400 kilometers transmission. So transporting energy in pipelines is 4 times more efficient than transporting energy with the grid. So it is questionable if it's the right approach to deliver energy through a grid from, for instance, Morocco over these long distances. And secondly, and this is also implied in the question, do we have, in particular in the heating sector, such a large consumption of electricity? Generally speaking, electricity and heating with heat pumps is very efficient. You take one part of electricity and get 3 parts of heat from it. Very good approach, but it requires specifically built homes. Most of the existing homes here are not ready for these kind of technologies. They need a very major refurbishment. You need to replace radiators, you need to replace, well, you need to insulate your houses quite significantly to quickly change the building sectors, particularly not without changing listed buildings, for instance. You need other solutions. That's the reason why we're also strongly advocating for a second route for decarbonizing the heating sector. Electricity has very strong market shares in newly built homes where we have these efficient preconditions. But in the existing homes, and we don't want to tear down all houses that we have and rebuild them. In existing homes, we need other solutions. So hydrogen in the heating sector, in boilers, in fuel cells, seems to be a quite viable solution.
I think, Daniel, you could also comment this question. And I would like to add a little idea. And I think for the gas industry, it would not be very wise to make a debate against electricity. And I think you already started to say at the end, we must work together. 2 energy carriers are needed for the future. But maybe you can discuss this transmission from North Africa. What are the transmission losses from gas pipelines? Maybe yes. You have an idea.
Happy to do so. One thing is the transmission losses. I think the other one, which goes back to the picture I showed you, is if you want to transport large amounts, you have a significant capex delta because your power lines are just very expensive given the amount of energy you can transport compared to transporting molecules. And that's something to keep in mind because I always find in this discussion that because it requires a little bit of imagination, we all tend to think in projects and we tend to think in, maybe we think about an industrial park that can be decarbonized, but we really have to think about systems and large quantities in the end. And I think the amounts of energy, if you recall the example I made, if you want to transport this hydrogen from some area where it's produced to the market, you not only need one pipeline, you potentially need a few pipelines in parallel. That's the amount. That's like the pipelines we have today running from Russia to Europe or from Norway to the North Sea to the continent. So it's just a dimension. But in terms of the power, absolutely. I mean, I think, well, if I may say so, because I've worked in this industry for quite some time, in the beginning, this was a bit like, head-to-head competition, should it be gas, should it be power? But that's actually nonsense because there are a lot of applications where direct usage of power is just the main and wisest thing to do. And it also doesn't make any sense to argue against that. But there is other things where you have to look out for, okay, if you want to use power, don't start to look at only your consumption, but what is the implications in the grid beforehand and how do you get the power there? And then we have to think about what is the sort of system efficiency and what is the best way. That's, I said in my presentation very clearly, and that's also the approach that we are taking with the other European TSOs, that we have to think together. And actually, I think given the history, the discussion between the power and the gas TSOs has also increased quite a bit because, everybody now, at least in the infrastructure side, thinks it's consensus that when you put, for example, when you consider an electrolyzer of a gigawatt size and you put it somewhere in the countryside where there's no power grid, your implications cost-wise on the power grid are huge and enormous. So it makes sense to look at this on a system sort of integrative view, and maybe it should be infrastructure players suggesting corridors, areas where these electrolyzers are best built, rather than others where they would actually only increase the cost in the system. So we're thinking both at the same time.
Okay. Thank you very much. There are questions concerning security of supply. I think we will leave this out for a moment, but there are other questions which are related to the gas grid. H2 is a smaller molecule than methane. So there are several questions asking what are the leakage rates of hydrogen compared to methane? Are there experiences about that?
I couldn't give you any specific number. What I can tell you is that rest assured, everybody who is operating a gas grid today has three priorities. The first one is safety, the second one is safety, and the third one is safety as well. We have to make sure that we want to put anything in operation that it is safe. But on the other hand, the phenomenon of hydrogen embrittlement, which people always mean when they say it's a small molecule and could it actually increase the cracks in your pipelines, this is something which is well known, and it requires that you understand, as I said, your asset, what kind of steels have you used, what is the condition the pipelines are in, and what is your operational way, how you drive the pipelines, because embrittlement and the amount of effect it has is really related to the number of pressure changes that you have in your system. And we need to sort of do some myth busting on some elements. For example, Air Liquide and Linde have been transporting hydrogen in steel pipelines, I think, for almost 100 years. It's working. You just need to take care and have your measures and your technical standards running. I couldn't give you an exact leakage rate, but I know, as I said, we have the systems running today, which are much smaller. I know Gasunie in the Netherlands has converted a gas pipeline to hydrogen in 2018. That's running without any problems. We need to be careful, but I think that's sort of part of our DNA.
I think this is a question which deserves further research.
Yes.
And there is another question from Ben Schlesinger, one of the big shots of our IAE association. He asked the question of how it would work to have different pipeline parts with different standards. What is the quality of the gas? Different biomethane and H2 mixes. The gas utility industry has usually adopted uniform standards and operational activities, programs, etc. How would they adapt to differentiating gas content from one another? So I think this is another very interesting question, which refers, I think, to both of you.
Tim, you want to go first?
Maybe I start first, yes. And it is both a technological and, of course, a regulatory question, how to deal with the transition from a pure natural gas system towards a green gas system, which might include different sorts of decarbonized energies, like hydrogen from different origins, biomethane, or also synthetic methane, which could also be an option in the grid. It seems, well, first of all, looking at the applications like I showed them and the distribution grids that is delivering the energy to the different homes, that it is a more viable solution to switch like a patchwork system from one island to another, basically directly to 100%. Because it requires quite a bit of effort to change the existing system, the existing boilers or heating devices in the industry from what we have today to something that is 100% hydrogen, ideally. We will, however, see certain islands in the system which will still require methane for certain process regions. And we would see also certain areas where we will allow for a blending of methane and hydrogen. Right now, and this is research done by our colleagues in the distribution grid, which is terms of length and in terms of customers, the largest extent that we have. That currently up to 20% of hydrogen can be blended into the system without any real implications. So the new boilers are prepared for 20%. The grid is prepared for 20%. In some cities here in Germany, we used to have town gas, which used to be a blend of 50% of hydrogen. So we have already the proof of the pudding that we can do quite a bit of blending, but every switch from one step of blending to the next step of blending requires some adaptations, for instance, in boilers. So we think that a binary step from something between 0 and 20 to 100% would be the right approach here. This, of course, leads, so that those are the technical implications. Boilers are prepared, which are the bulk of the applications at the end. The regulatory aspects are also quite interesting. So what's my individual tariff as a gas customer? Do I have to pay the hydrogen tariff? Do I have to pay a blending tariff? And this will certainly lead to interesting questions in regulation. It will also lead to interesting question to regulation in the gas production. But it also will lead, or possibly also trigger, completely new forms of technology to measure and account for data and gas data. So we see, for instance, a big application for blockchain solutions in this area, so that I, as a customer, have an individual contract for whatever blending and for whatever carbon reduction I want to buy.
Yeah, I'm just maybe picking up on this one. I said in my presentation that we probably have to differentiate between where we are in the grid. Are we high pressure or in a distribution grid? And also which regions we are in. I think it's important to say that the technical association of our gas industry is actively working on new standards, both for the blend as well as for 100% networks, because that's very important that we have that when we want to put things in operation. That is all ongoing as we speak. And I think the one point from our perspective, which we believe is important, is that we need to make sure that we're not creating, so that's the third perspective, if you want the trading perspective, that we're not creating barriers to trade, and that we want to make sure that at border points, we have a possibility to basically, as today, have a transit system, be able to transport from different regions to different regions, which then probably gives a case for the pure hydrogen network on the main routes of high volume transport. Yeah, I think that would be our answer.
I would like to come now to the issue of security of supply. And there are several interesting questions. One is, do you think that this pyrolysis technology would be large scale or more small scales in the neighborhood of the customers? Mm-hmm. And the second type of questions is, of course, do you think that Russia, which is actually, and maybe in the future, one of the big suppliers of methane, would do the pyrolysis and then export hydrogen?
Mm-hmm. First of all, scaling it up. The bigger the scale of these applications, the cheaper the hydrogen is. That's simple economic reasoning behind it. So we expect that these kind of installations have a capacity of 100,000 cubic meters per hour, at least, so that we have adequate prices. So pretty much in the scale like we see current steam methane reforming devices. So smaller scale applications are possible indeed. Here in Berlin, for instance, a company is working on plasma pyrolysis, and they are providing one hotel with hydrogen using pyrolysis. But this certainly is not the cheapest solution, I would say, for decarbonizing a single home. So rather central solutions are certainly key. But given the scale, this should happen closer to larger industrial customers, for instance, here in Germany. rather than close to the wellhead in the production countries, because it is, at the end of the day, more efficient to do these kind of processes closer to the customer rather than distributing over 6,000-7,000 kilometers hydrogen. This leads me also to the point of energy or security of supply, which also has been asked by one or the other. These routes which use natural gas as a feedstock will certainly provide a certain stability in the current system and will offer, of course, also the opportunity to diversify our energy supplies. So it is still open where the natural gas comes, comes from. We have a very broad setup of relationships with individual countries. And on the other side, this offers the opportunity to use the existing grid for new partnerships like the one that has been discussed with Morocco or other areas where hydrogen can be produced cheaply. I personally am very convinced that the hydrogen solution will also add to the unification process of the European Union, because right now we have very nationalistic approaches to producing renewable energy and to subsidizing renewable energy. We're not really exploring and exploiting the big potential that Europe in itself has, with a lot of wind at the Atlantic coast, with a lot of sun in the south, in Greece, in Spain, and using these as input sources for using or producing hydrogen and delivering it via a European hydrogen backbone to the industrial centers, for instance, here in Germany. So we shouldn't only focus on PV in Germany. We don't have too much sun here. We should rather use this as an opportunity to integrate Europe further. And a hydrogen union, I think, is a very strong and good vision to have. So we should explore that.
Daniel, you can also, on this Russian, do you really think that Russia will not export hydrogen, but rather methane?
Well, let's put it that way. Just adding a little bit of, I wouldn't say controversy, but just competition, and that's actually what I think is good. I don't personally. I think green hydrogen has an opportunity to come to the market faster than in 20 years if we manage the scale up. But the good thing, if Europe moves ahead as it is currently foreseeing, is that if we credibly set the path, for example, in incentivizing the use of hydrogen in our sectors, i.e. creating the demand, there will be competition from the supplying side. And I know personally, and also through some project engagements, that there are projects with big financial investors in the background trying to get a green hydrogen project off the ground in Southern Europe, which would be able to produce quite competitively in about 10 to 15 years. And if that's happening at the same time where others are looking into launching fast track blue hydrogen projects or pyrolysis projects, that's not bad for us in terms of security of supply, and it's also not bad in terms of benefit for the customer, because ultimately, as we said, it needs to become big, but we need to bring the price down. Because as a politician, I can understand if you set the path for renewable power and hydrogen, you want to make sure that you don't have to subsidize this until all eternity. It has to become competitive. And I think that's why it's so important. We've started, I showed you all these hydrogen strategies which are coming out, that we now go into the implementation so that more and more customers, industrial players who think about reinvesting in their factories actually become real hydrogen customers, because then we trigger the value chain.
Thank you for this answer. I think my personal view is actually we judge costs and technology under the situation that we have this energy system which is dominated by fossil fuels. And we cannot imagine how an energy system would look like which is not dominated by fossil fuel, but something else. And we must identify the market potential of hydrogen is based only in this situation when there is not fossil fuel anymore allowable in the energy system. And as we are not really, to my view, it makes no sense to say we compare the cost. we compare the cost with natural gas. Everything is cheaper than nothing is cheaper than natural gas. Natural gas is a very, very nice energy carrier. But if we cannot use the natural gas anymore because of this greenhouse gas issue, yeah, then we have to find other solutions. And that is the start. My comment on this security of supply. Maybe it's your view also, but I don't know.
I would like to just sort of give everybody listening just one exercise to think about. I mean, at the moment, everything is dynamic. Within the last 2 years, 3 years, so many things have started, projects, research, activities, that all the assumptions that we are working with in our calculations today are still based on some literature research from like 5 or 10 years ago. I would suggest they're all pretty much outdated now. New numbers are being produced as we speak. We don't know yet where they are. But just take the example, and I keep saying this at conferences because I think it's so interesting to challenge people. If you just look at the cost of electrolyzers, which are being in World Energy Outlook or other sort of analysis looking out to 2050, and then you allow for a second that there are people now, even in realistic projects, saying that an electrolyzer could come down in cost within the next 15 years to about 200 euros per kilowatt instead of 800 or 1,000. And if you allow at the same time that green power production in areas where there's a lot of sun or a lot of wind could come down from 4 euros per megawatt hour down to about 1 euro. So 1 cent per kilowatt hour for power generation, and you put those numbers together, and you then ask yourself, all the reports that we keep getting every year, which forecast what the future will look in 2050, would look completely different if you allow for these assumptions to be changed. And that's, I think, what you, Georg, just mentioned. If we imagine for a second that the world could look quite different, then the solution space is very different again. So I'm sorry, I just mixed up the units. So I was talking 40 euros per megawatt hour power, or 10 euros, or 4 cents, or 1 cent.
I will go to the last group of questions which refer to fuel cells and applications of fuel cell. Tim, you presented us a picture of a fuel cell, but for the stationary application, do you think that that the market entry of fuel cells would be also transport applications, and which type of transport applications? And do you think that there will be a future? I know there is in Japan or in Switzerland, they have a company, a project which bought 50 trucks, fuel cell trucks, and they developed a hydrogen filling infrastructure of 5 filling stations all around Switzerland. So that means this technology will as an entry point. But is this the right way, or is it only private cars or whatsoever?
It's a big question, and many viewers have asked the question what I think about the hydrogen car and its applications. That's the reason why I brought the picture of the Bosch project, the SOFC fuel cell they're working on. Bosch is primarily known, of course, as an automotive supplier, and it seems like they have also this market in mind when they develop this application. However, the first product they built around this fuel cell stack that they developed is a stationary fuel cell. And the rationale behind it is that the application in a mobile environment, particularly a car, truck is already a little bit more easier to handle, but particularly the car is a very tricky system. You have individual users, you need many filling stations to provide enough comfort, and you need a stable system that is capable of running or making 200 kilometers here in Germany on the Autobahn. So it is, I would say, the ultimate goal that we should aim for. But why not start in the boiler room, in the basements of our houses, rather than looking into the garage where we have the shiny cars, and also quite promising other solutions with the battery electric vehicle also in place. So my guess is we will see the fuel cell, which is a very promising technology. We'll see large steps in terms of not technological involvement, but in terms of industrial scaling now. that we see the application of these always cheaper fuel cells in the stationary applications, replacing decentral power production. Combined heat and power is a big application. So these are the primary markets I would see where the fuel cell would fit in.
It is clear that the price of a fuel cell, which could have a market, could be much higher per kilowatt capacity if it is used in stationary applications than in vehicle. The car is such a complex product, which is so cheap that it's really difficult to compete in this segment.
It's not only the fuel cell stack, it's the complete system around it, and that also needs to be calculated. This makes it quite costly at the end of the day.
But I think we will stop here the discussion. I hope that we have answered most of the questions, at least, which come from the auditorium. I think this presentation of you, Daniel and Tim, was a brilliant introduction of you into the world.
Which can be shared, by the way. Sorry to interrupt, but there was one question if we can.
Excuse me?
Yes, of course we can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please. Yeah, if you want to answer a question, no problem.
No, sorry. There was simply one question. If we share the presentation and
okay, that is. I think Dave will just tell us that everything will be available on the internet, etc. Yeah. So that is, of course, yeah. So thank you very much. I think there are some comments from our auditorium which congratulate the speakers for these brilliant presentations. And also from my side and from the moderator side, I think it was a successful and interesting view. It is not the end of the discussion, but maybe the beginning, and we have to do more of this type of presentations in the future, probably with more data on costs and markets, etc. So thank you very much, and I will give back to Aaron.
Yes, thank you very much for these interesting presentations and also for the discussion from our side. Yeah, we hope that you as the audience enjoyed our event today. And I am quite sure that AAEE and GEE, this will not be the last event that we are hosting. So thank you very much for tuning in. Back to you, Dave.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Daniel and Tim, for clearly an outstanding presentation. Really thank you for your efforts and your expertise here, as well as to GEE and AAEE.
Dave, you should make your picture on.
Oh, sorry, I'm happy.
Yes, no, thank you.
It's good to see you all. Thank you very much. I mean, this topic is so hot. It's going to be with us for quite some time. And I'm just very grateful for everybody's support and help in bringing about the dialogue today. And you're quite right, Georg. We're just scratching the surface on this, and there's going to be many more webinars on this topic. So as a reminder to you all, this has been recorded. It will be available on our Rewind this afternoon. The presentations that were presented will be available on our website as well. Open access, free to all. Please download and share with your colleagues. A reminder, we welcome you to join our association, IAEE, at www.iaee.org, but also a reminder to join our two affiliates, GEE and AAEE as well. Thank you for listening. Wish you all a great rest of your day, wherever this finds you on our fine globe. And I officially close this webinar.